2.5 more minutes to read the passage and respond to it. If you finish early, can you just chat a 100 so that way I know to keep our pacing up? I would really appreciate it. But you still have 2.5 minutes to finish. I know some of us are coming in from the honor roll luncheon. To those of you that just chatted me and said and gave a 100, can you tell me if you decided yes or no? So that, or yes, no, or maybe, so I can run a quick review after. You guys have 2 more minutes if you're still reading and responding. Awesome, thank you, Jade. Thank you, Isis. Thank you, Kezia. Thank you, Janaya. Awesome, 1 more minute to everybody who is finishing up. And then we'll review as a group before we jump into the lecture. Thank you, Zira. Thank you, Erica. 30 more seconds to finish your initial thoughts. Okay, should we require voting? Yes or no? I'll start with volunteers. If I don't get any, I will cold call. Should we require voting? Awesome. Can I start with Isis and then Kezia?
I said that it makes sense why they would want people to require voting, because it'll allow the government to see like the majority's opinion. But I think that they shouldn't, because if people don't want to get involved in politics, then they shouldn't be forced to.
I said no, because people should be able to make their own decisions.
Awesome. Anybody else like to jump in before we transition to the lecture? Awesome. That's definitely the trend that was going on in the other class as well. The idea that it makes sense why you might want to require it, but ultimately it doesn't really make sense. Okay. Oops, that's on the wrong side. So today we are going to be having a lecture. So go ahead and take 1 minute to get yourself set up with either paper or a Google Doc to take lecture notes. And the name of this lecture is Voting Rights, or just voting in general. So take 1 minute to get your paper set up with the title of Voting or Voting Rights, and then we will jump right in. Okay, and if you can just chat a 100 when you have your notes set up. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your urgency. Give us 15 more seconds to get set up. Cool. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. And in terms of voting, we're first going to start with a history of voting rights. If you guys can give me just 1 minute, I just realized that because I'm not presenting, I can't see my script on the slides. So while you guys get a history of voting rights and suffrage and enfranchisement written down, I'm going to get my lecture notes pulled up on my iPad. So the first thing that I want to clarify in terms of voting rights is making sure we have a clear understanding of definitions. The first definition that we need to know is suffrage and enfranchisement. Both of these terms refer to the ability or allowance to vote. So if you are practicing suffrage, that means you get to vote. If you are practicing enfranchisement, that means you have the right to vote. In something that was originally the plan that changes over time, is the original plan was to let the states decide who could and could not vote. So again, originally it was up to the states to decide who could and could not vote. But as we know, with amendments, that starts to change. The next key term that I want to make sure we know is electorate. An electorate refers to the potential voting population. So again, the electorate is the potential voting population. So once you guys turn 18, you will be a part of the electorate. Now, when we look at the electorate, we know through history that the electorate has expanded over the history of the United States. And there are two trends that lead to this expansion. The first is eliminations of restrictions. So pretty self-explanatory. The restrictions to vote are limited or removed. And the change of suffrage power. Now, the electorate has grown in 5 stages. So again, the electorate has grown in 5 stages in American history. The first is they eliminated religious qualifications. The second is they eliminated voter discrimination based on race or color. So again, the first two is the growth of the electoral system grew in 5 stages. The first is eliminating religious qualifications. The second is the end of discrimination based off of race or color. The third stage was eliminating gender qualifications. The fourth is protecting voters' right to vote. And we'll talk more about what that looks like later. So again, protecting voters' right to vote. And finally, the last stage is the minimum age to vote is lowered from 21 to 18. Next, we're going to look at, one second, there we go. Next, we're going to look at how the Constitution protects our right to vote. And it does it in 5 different ways, which are listed on the slide, and I'll explain each of them. The first protection is state regulations. And what this refers to is that the state must allow the same voters to vote in every single election. So again, the same voters can vote in all elections. And so what this means is, let's just to give an example, you do not need to write this down. I'm just giving an example for what this means. An example of this is, let's say New York decided to lower the voting age to 17. They could not allow you to vote as a 17-year-old in local elections and not federal elections. If you are allowed to vote in New York, you are allowed to vote in every single election, so long as you have done all of the work to be able to. The second protection or expansion of the right to vote was in the 15th Amendment. And as we know, the 15th Amendment prohibits discrimination of voting based on race. The next expansion of the right to vote is the 19th Amendment, which means that you cannot discriminate voters based off of gender. Now, the next two you guys might not be quite as familiar with from APUSH. The 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes. So again, the 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes, which means that no state can require payment to be able to vote. And finally, the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. Next, we're going to transition and look at voter qualifications. So those are the protection. We just discussed the protections for voters. Now let's look and see how do we qualify to vote? So that should be your next subheading in your Cornell notes. And we're going to start first with the universal requirements. Each state has 3 basic qualifications to vote. And make sure you guys leave room next to these 3 so I can explain what this refers to. And each state requires these 3 basic qualifications to vote: citizenship, residence, and age. Citizenship refers to you have to be a legal US citizen to vote. So for example, if somebody is here on a legal green card and is actively working in the United States, if they do not have citizenship, they still cannot vote. Just as an example. Next is and the next one is residency, which means a person has to live in the state for a certain amount of time to be able to vote. Sorry, how do I go back? There we go. So again, citizenship is legal US citizens you have to be a legal US citizen to be able to vote. And residency, you have to live in a state for a certain amount of time before you can vote. And this is to stop parties from this is to stop parties or candidates from bribing outsiders to affect the outcome of local elections. So for example, when I moved to New York, I had to live here for a certain amount of time before I could vote, because they wanted to make sure that, one, I was a permanent citizen of New York who was invested in the local issues. Yes, Naisha. Lauren, really good question. As far as I know, this is something I can look into a little bit deeper. I think the amount of time depends on the state. So like some states might require a year, other states might require 6 months. Other states just might require that you change your permanent residency to that state and get like a local driver's license. So like, for example, you can't have a California and a New York ID at the same time. When I went to the DMV to get my New York like proof of residency, I had to surrender my California license in order to do that. So it depends on the state how long they require. Great question, Aisha. Tangent, yes, I did cry because I didn't know that they were going to take it from me, and I didn't like have any like ceremonious like, here's my California ID. It was just gone, and I was like, oh, okay, bye. Yes, so be prepared for that if you guys move out of state. It's weird. And then finally, age is the other requirement. As we've discussed, it was lowered to 18. So that's not really different than what we've discussed earlier. The next requirement that we have to follow is registration. And states require voters to register to vote. And the purpose of registration is it's a form of voter identification to prevent potential voter fraud. And registration looks pretty different depending on how you do it. For example, when I went to the DMV, I just had to check a box that said I wanted to register to vote in New York State. If you haven't gotten your license yet, you'll have the opportunity to just click a box that says register me to vote when I turn 18. You can also like register online. It takes like 90 seconds, or you can do it in a variety of different ways. And different states have different deadlines on when to register to vote. So basically voting is a two-step process. First you register and then you actually do the thing. You do the voting. Now we're going to transition and we're going to finish our lecture. Yes, today is actually a pretty succinct lecture. I know you guys are super excited. We're going to finish our lecture by looking at traditional voter behavior and how people behave when they vote and some trends that we might be able to pick up on. And first, let's zoom in and look at non-voters and consider why non-voters behave the way that they do. First, what's really interesting about presidential election years, so like for example, 2020, people typically vote more during presidential election years than in either local or state elections, or even in Senate or House of Representative elections. Because presidential elections have an image of being more important, people tend to prioritize voting for the president, even though local issues are just as, if not more important, just because of the way they appear. And obviously, as the number of votes declines, the number of people voting declines from starting at the big federal election of presidency and then going down to congressional and then state or local elections. So interest starts to drop. And the reason, what is usually discussed as a reason for this is ballot fatigue. And ballot fatigue basically just means like, I'm too tired to vote. My vote's probably not going to make a difference. The weather's really bad and I don't want to go to my polling place. Or just lack of interest in the candidates or the office. So ballot fatigue refers to the explanations as to why somebody might not choose to vote. And these can range from the weather is bad to I don't think I'm informed enough to vote. Basically, Lauren, and like these are excuses that range from being reasonable or understandable to like you should be voting. And we're going to talk more about what potential hazards are in front of people before they are able to vote. And finally, the last kind of reason why people might not vote is because of distrust or disbelief. Especially since the Nixon presidency, trust in the government and trust in politicians has greatly dropped. So this is something that we're feeling a lot just over your guys' lifetime. But this is something that's been going on since the 70s and Watergate. But because people have this understanding that the government cannot be trusted or cannot be believed, there's this like existential, then why should I even vote then? Now, so those tend to be the trends or reasons behind people who do not vote. Now we're going to look at the trends of who does vote. And these are the three main factors that go into who traditionally will vote in every election. This is not to speak to all, obviously, but this speaks to the majority. Most people who vote are have had some form of higher education. So if you have a So like the higher your education goes, the more likely you are to vote. Same thing as the higher your income, the more likely you are to vote. And most voters tend to be middle-aged. Sorry, I have to do a bunch of clicking. Now we're going to discuss other factors that might influence our voting. All that you see on the screen, age, education, religion, race, gender, income, occupation, all of those things can somewhat predict how likely you are to vote. And these are all sociological factors. Sociological is spelled SOCIOLOGICAL. And now I'm going to go through and explain how some of these factors might influence your vote. In regards to age, the younger you are, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. And the older you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. So again, for age, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be Democrat, and the older you are, the more likely you are to be Republican. Now, when it comes to education, this is tricky. So I want you guys to pause and listen to what I say, and then I'll repeat it for you to write it down, because it sounds kind of weird when I say it the first time. So I'm going to say it once for you guys to listen, and then you guys can write it down. So when it comes to education, the more educated you are, the more likely you're going to vote Republican. Except once you get to a master's degree or a PhD, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. Okay, I'm going to say that again one more time. Thank you guys for pausing and listening. So again, the more educated you are, the more likely you're going to vote Republican. Except when it comes to a graduate degree, like a master's or a PhD, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. Yes, Erica, go ahead and jump in.
So are you saying that dropouts are most likely to be Republicans?
So not necessarily dropouts. What it means is, like, if you are going to school for an associate's or a bachelor's, you're more likely to get to be, the more likely you are to be a Republican. Again, this isn't an automatic predictor, it's just more likely. So if you have an associate's or a bachelor's, you're more likely to be a Republican. But if you go on to graduate school for a master's or a PhD, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. And just speaking as somebody that did go to graduate school is a lot more theoretical and thinky, and the more isolated you get with people that are already liberal. So that could be part of the factor. Okay, so I'll say it one more time. If you have an associate's or a if you have an associate's or a bachelor's degree, the more likely you are to be Republican. But if you have a master's degree or a PhD, the more likely you are to be Democrat. Okay, So now racial and ethnic backgrounds. If you are a person of color, you're more likely to vote Democrat. For gender, if you're a woman, you're more likely to vote Democrat. For income, the more money you make, the more likely it is you'll be a Republican. And finally, for occupation. If you have a job that is unionized, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. Again, if you have a job that is unionized, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. And again, these are factors that might influence your voting. These are not predictors. I know a lot of white male Democrats, and I have encountered, at least through social media and things like that, a lot of women of color who are Republicans. So this gives you a general trend. This is not an absolute science. Now I'm going to skip through just a quick slide so we can get to the last one. Okay. We're going to end looking at candidates and very quickly a candidate's relationship with the electorate. And these are things that go into a candidate's image. Because of the news cycle we have today, voters are far more informed now than they were in the past. I'm going to skip down to the mental picture because I'm going to spend a little bit more time on policies and voters. So candidates have to fit the mental picture of looking presidential for the electorate. For example, in the 1959 debates between JFK and Richard Nixon, those are the first televised presidential debates ever. And many people say that if it was radio debates instead of TV, Richard Nixon would have won. Because he had more prestige in politics, because his ideas were a little bit more thought out, but because JFK looked kinder, because JFK was handsome, he won the election because of televised debates. So that's what we mean by the president has to, like, candidates have to look presidential, or that is an appeal for some voters. Now, backing up to policies and voters. As we know, candidates are paying attention to the needs and concerns of the electorate. For example, the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer of 2020 absolutely 110% affected Biden's campaign. If those protests did not happen, I don't I'm not sure if Biden would have included police reform in his talking points. He might have, I'm not sure. But whatever is happening that is relevant or is the most concern to voters is what is going to is what a presidential candidate is going to take a stand on. For example, Trump in 2016 knew that illegal immigrants were a concern of his voting base. And so he decided to capitalize and he decided to capitalize on it and really push that kind of rhetoric. So that is what kind of power the electorate has on candidates, is we can sway them to leaning towards one direction or the other. Okay, that is it for the lecture. I know it was a bit of a smoother one than economic policies. Any questions or concerns or anything you guys need me to repeat? Kezia, what do you need me to read? Okay, I'm gonna go back. Sorry, let me go back. Okay, so for age, again, for age, the younger you are, the more likely you're going to vote Democrat. And the older you are, the more likely you're going to be Republican. And again, I know the education one was a little tricky. For education, if you have an associate's or a bachelor's degree, the more likely you're going to vote Republican. If you have a graduate degree, like a master's or a PhD, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. Bachelor's and associate's Republican, master's and PhD Democrat. Bachelor's and associate's Republican, master's and PhD Democrat. I've said it too many times. Now it's getting tongue-tied. Cool. Yes, Lauren just asked the question. I will be uploading the video of this lecture once it buffers and goes through YouTube, and I link it. It usually is like, because of YouTube buffering with the school Wi-Fi, it should be up by like 2:15. It just takes a few minutes for it to get through. Any other questions, concerns, or things you need me to repeat? Naisha, there isn't a definition for registration. Registration is just something you have to do. So to register to vote, you literally just have to put in your information and say you're going to vote. So that way, when you go to your polling place, they can check you off their list. So the purpose of registration is that you are assigned a polling place where you do your voting. And then that polling place has like an attendance log where they can verify that you're supposed to be there to vote. Cool. With that being said, I'm going to